You could harvest on a good year 20 tonnes to the acre of apples, so it does add up.
So how many trees would you have?
So in general, our trees are small and planted close together, so about 1,000 trees to the acre, so maybe 40,000 apple trees in total.
Irish apples can be hard to get your hands on, but if you do find them, they will be absolutely delicious, and there's a decent chance they were grown by Contrast, owner of the apple farm in Kerr, County Tipperary. He's one of our great growers and a passionate fruit growing guru, and he's my guest on this episode of Food Matters. Welcome back to the show. I'm Mick Kelly, and in this series I'm meeting the people who are reconnecting us with real, healthy, sustainable food. They tell us why food matters to them and why it should matter to you too. So did you know that Ireland is very well suited for growing apples? But would you believe, despite that, over 95% of the apples we eat here are imported? Contrast has been running his apple farm in County Tipperary very successfully since he took it over from his parents, who planted it when they moved to Ireland from Holland in the 1960s. A lot of the apples that Con grows are sold directly from his on-site farm shop, and he makes juice, cider, crisps, vinegar, jams and jellies for many of the others. The farm is also an agri-tourism business where you can camp and stay. And Con is also mentoring the next generation of Irish teachers and horticulturalists as a lecturer in the University of Limerick. Con's story is a masterclass in how to make a successful Irish fruit business, and he shares his story and his passion for Irish fruit in this episode of Food Matters.
They just said, look, do you want the farm or not? So it was just as simple as that, and I had to think about it. And I said, oh yeah, grand, No pressure, because they would have either farmed on a bit or maybe sold it or who knows. Yeah. I found Dunn stores to be very helpful, very agreeable.
Okay.
I couldn't say a bad word. All right. I was very happy.
It's unusual for a food producer to be. No, it's great. Yeah. That's great to hear. And that, I think, suggests an openness to working with a good Irish product and a consumer demand for that, right?
This year, Poland's crop is down about 70% due to very bad spring. So you just can't...
70?
About 70% down, yeah.
That's like carnage for
it is carnage
growers,
for
right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's just a weather lottery these days. So it's them this year, it could be you next year or somebody else next year. Who knows?
Now, I know it's possible to buy apples all year round, but this time of the year really is apple season, and it's a joy to see the freshly harvested local Irish apples starting to appear on the shelves. So naturally, it's a busy time of the year for Con, and we started by chatting about what's happening on his farm at the moment. It's brilliant to have you here, and thank you for making the trip at a busy time of the year for you still. Are you still you're
busy.
Still harvesting?
Apple harvest is all finished. So at the moment, actually, we're getting ready to plant a new orchard. We're taking out a few old trees and we're packing all of the apples that are picking for us, finished it about 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
Making juices and stuff as well.
What's the last variety?
The last variety we pick every year is Golden Delicious, would you believe? We still have a few of those. Nowadays, there are varieties that, that can run a little bit later, maybe can be grown in Ireland, but it's not necessarily a good idea because if they run too late, they just won't ripen.
Yeah. Okay, so about 3 weeks ago, so we're recording this in coming towards the end of November. So you had apples coming off trees early November?
Early November,
wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, brilliant. Okay, so a little bit of a pause maybe then for you work-wise, I guess, is it? Or is it just...
Yeah,
is there any time of the year where there is a bit of a pause?
Well, for me, the most quiet time is usually in the springtime when the pruning of the trees and that is, kind of... I won't say finished, but it's clipping along fairly nicely, and there's not much change to the daily routine. When there's change to the daily routine, you're always busy because you don't know what you've got to sort out next kind of thing, So, yeah.
So that's when, like May?
We're pruning now, and we'll be pruning continuously between now and probably, we'd like to get it done by the start of April, really, when the trees are beginning to come out of dormancy. But in reality, there are some apple trees that we'll leave a little bit later. If we see that, that we don't know how many flowers they're going to have, we can wait until they begin to open, and that gives us a bit of more flexibility in what we take off and what we don't. And then the plums are only pruned sort of in even late May, June. So that's the ideal time for pruning plums, whereas all the apples are done while they're dormant.
Okay. So we'll get back to all of that, obviously.
Yep.
What I want to start with is just little bit of backstory, I guess, because like the interesting thing for me here is your parents moved here from Holland in the 1960s. And like, obviously there's part of me I'd love to also talk about for a son to take over a business like that and that transition and so on. But maybe what brought them to Ireland and to Care?
There was a big post-war generation. My father was born before the Second World War. My mother was born just at the start of it.
Yeah.
And family sizes tended to be big even in the Netherlands then. And, with the disruption to education during the war and that kind of thing, there was a lot of practical training went on in, topics like engineering and agriculture and so on. So you had this big bulk of, of young people growing up, I suppose, in Holland in the 1950s and into the 60s that were, trained in things that they just didn't have enough land in Holland for all the potential farmers they had or so on. So, emigration resulted and a lot of horticulturally trained Dutch people who were very, Holland was already a very strong horticultural, traditions at that stage, went all around the world. So you will find them still in, the United States, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia and places like that. And a few came to Ireland, like the Vogelaar family here in Waterford, for example, they arrived in the years preceding my parents. My parents came here and, and others, yeah.
It's always like amazes me about Holland for a small country, like similar size to Ireland, I guess, isn't it? Like,
I think it's only about a third of the size, actually.
Okay, so like a third of the size of Ireland, and yet like an absolute powerhouse when it comes to production of veg and flowers and fruit. It had that pedigree already, but did the war accelerate that sort of need to be self-sufficient and
possibly? I mean, I wouldn't be great on answering that question for you, except to say, that there is a lot of, Holland being a, kind of, just general Rhine estuary, there's a lot of very fertile land in that, so it would have lent itself to agricultural production, and an awful lot of the agricultural production that goes on there, in the tillage sector is not just tillage. Tillage farmers are vegetable farmers, if you know what I mean. So that's part of just a general rotation that they would have. So here in Ireland, where you would have tillage farmers that most of them don't grow vegetables. In Holland they would, but of course if every tillage farmer in Ireland grew vegetables, we'd be laughing. We'd be laughing. We'd also have far more than we can consume. Do you know what I mean? So whereas in Holland, there's such a huge market both domestically and nearby that they can move it out. And of course they started draining the Cider Zee after the war as well, and that gave them this very fertile polder land which was suitable for growing any kind of horticultural crop. Their original plans were to drain the whole place, but then for ecological reasons they realized that was not a good idea, so they stopped. But the land that was reclaimed, which was still very significant in area, again you see magnificent crops of the likes of potatoes and onions and even some fruit grown there, although not so much anymore fruit, more so the vegetables.
So you said like big families. So were your grandparents, like, were they fruit growers?
On my father's side. On my mother's side, it was dairy farm.
So there was no land available. So your father came here in search of land, effectively.
Yes. Now, in his family, he was the only one that wanted to stay at home, if you know. So his older brother actually did get some land on the polder, which was rented. It wasn't owned. They were sharing the home farm with my grandfather, I should say. That was never going to be easy, I suppose. So they decided to split that up again and come here. And they had been here, I think, twice before. They knew that you could grow. They had seen orchards in Ireland and stuff. They knew apples would grow here. So they were reasonably satisfied that it wouldn't be a total risk, if you know what I mean.
And so they came here in the 1960s, and did they acquire the land sort of straight away, or how did...
they had some auctioneers looking for land for them, and briefing them when farms came up around the place and so on. They had a budget, so that had to be met as well, which is one of the reasons why they ended up in the farm they did. The farm that they ended up buying, which was in 1967, was owned by an electrician by the name of Tommy Sampson, and Tommy hadn't farmed it because he was an electrician, so it was kind of abandoned, and there wasn't a lot of interest from any other farmers because it was in a rough enough state and all of that. So, because I think it hadn't been farmed in maybe 10 years or thereabouts before they got it. So they ended up just buying that one,
with the intention of apples,
of going all horticultural. In fact, they wouldn't have been given permission because at that time there wasn't free movement of people, so they actually had to give an undertaking that they would be horticultural production and mostly fruit.
Okay. Have you got a sense that like they picked this part of Ireland for that reason? Like, or was it?
No, it was more okay.
We do have a better climate.
Yeah,
than
they were going
corner.
to go to the south, of course. Yeah, but could have as easily been Waterford or Cork.
Yeah,
or,
right.
You know.
So it was
Wexford
taking what became available at a good price or whatever. Yeah. Okay, so I'm curious then, for you growing up, did it feel like it was kind of preordained that you'd work at this, or how did you feel about it?
Not necessarily, because when I was growing up, you know, the first orchard they planted was 7 acres, and then they planted another 4, and that was, you know, I was already like 12 or 13 years of age by the time they planted the next 4. So the farm was still mostly, well, there was some vegetables, but we were getting out of vegetables then because you either had to scale up on vegetables, or, you know, there was no place left for a person doing 2 acres of veg, you know what I mean? And
when did that happen?
So that was in the, I suppose, the late 70s, early 80s when we got out of veg. Yeah. Because you know, once you had the machinery, you might as well be growing 100 acres as 2, you know.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. So whereas fruit doesn't scale like that, because so much of it is hand labor and so on. You can run a fruit farm at almost any scale, and the person on double the scale doesn't have a huge advantage. Their wage bill will be double, you know, because there's much less mechanization. But in any case, at that time we were growing, you know, arable crops as well, wheat and barley, and, you know, sugar beet and stuff like that. And of course, being that age, I loved all that tractor work and all that kind of thing. So that's what I was kind of thinking I might end up farming as, rather than growing fruit. Yeah.
You did end up taking over. When did you take over the farm?
Yeah, so I officially took over, I think it was 1994. Now I'm not great on dates like that, because I don't, they all melt into each other. But yeah, I had a brother who was 3 years younger than me, and both of us went to college, and, you know, neither of us had a firm idea who'd take over the farm or anything like that. But unfortunately he died in a motorbike accident. So that was 1989. So at that stage, he was 18. He was only started in college.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So that was very tough on the parents, especially, of course. At that stage, then, you know, it was only a question of, would I take it or wouldn't I? Not immediately, but by the time...
Were you studying ag?
I was coincidentally studying ag science, but it wasn't because I wanted to become a farmer. It was because I thought I already knew a lot about it and it'd be really easy for me. It was just pure laziness that had me studying ag. It's only when I went to study it that I realised I knew nothing. Yeah. I finished that degree in 1991, and then I stayed on to do a master's. At that stage I was kind of enjoying college and that kind of thing, so that took another year or two. That was in UCD. And I got a chance to do some lecturing at that time as well, because my master supervisor left the country for a while, and so I was doing that and enjoying it, and then my parents were wondering whether I'd ever appear back at all. So they
perpetual student.
Yeah, exactly. So they just said, look, do you want the farm or not, kind of thing, you know what I mean? So it was just as simple as that, and I had to think about it, and I said, oh yeah, grand, you know, I'll take it. But there was no pressure, you know, because they, you know, they would have either farmed on a bit or maybe sold it, or who knows. But
it wasn't this mad like generational attachment to the land.
No, exactly. Yeah,
interesting. I've noticed you're working in UL, lecturing in UL now as well as business. I thought that was a kind of a new thing, but you were actually lecturing then back.
Well,
like
at the time, in I suppose at the time before I got the farm, I was actually lecturing in UCD. And then that job came up in Limerick, which I just went along for. I think I was the only applicant, actually. There were so few people with the kind of qualification that I had at that time, that, you know, so it got that job in Limerick, and it was a part-time lecturing job, which I'm still doing to this day. So
and you enjoy that?
Oh, I love it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What part of it do you enjoy? Is it the
imparting
the knowledge?
Yeah, it's easy to say it because it's also hard work to teach, but it's also a privilege to teach, if you know what I mean. And I love getting across knowledge and seeing people enjoying learning. Do you know what I mean? And seeing them know stuff afterwards, and dots connecting and lights going off.
What are you teaching in UL at the moment?
So at this term, right now, I'm teaching plant physiology. There's a small bit of a biology module, which I run the biology module and I teach part of that. And the next term I'll be teaching horticulture.
Okay. And what are these undergraduates?
Undergraduates, yeah.
What would the course be that they're...
So there are various courses. Let's say the biology course, everyone who takes a science in UL has to do biology, if you know what I mean. So that's 400 students, there's lots of them. And then with horticulture, they're actually education students, so they're becoming secondary school teachers.
Wow.
Because they're going to be qualified to teach ag science in secondary school, they need some horticulture.
Right, very good. Okay, so give us a sense of the scale of it now, because it's obviously, you mentioned the original was 7 acres and then a bit added on and so on. What's the size of the farm?
Yeah, so the farm they bought was 60 acres, which it still is. Okay. But, as I said, originally they just planted one corner in apples and a bit of plums and some strawberries and, brassicas and various things, and ordinary agricultural crops. It's still 60 acres, but we do have another 17 acres which we rent, of which 7 has apples on it.
Okay, so that's all apples.
Of the original farm, there's probably at the moment about 35 acres of apples going back up again, because we pulled out some trees to make room for new trees, but you have got to wait a little while. So in general, that'll probably hover around the 40 acres out of the 60, and then there's plums, strawberries, raspberries and things like that on the remaining land on the original farm.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of land, right? How many trees are we talking?
Yeah. Well, 60 acres wouldn't be considered a big farm now by arable standards.
By Irish standards in apples, would it be?
Oh, in apples, yes. I suppose it would be about average, you know what I mean? Or maybe a bit above average.
Okay.
But, if you were to talk to a dairy farmer or something, they'd wonder what you were doing with 60 acres.
Yeah. There's a point in that, isn't there, about apple production then can be quite significant on a relatively small land mass.
Which is the same with a lot of horticulture crop. If you have 10 acres of potatoes, it could be 200, 250 tons, something similar with apples. In fact, you could harvest on a good year 20 tons to acre of apples, so it does add up. Yeah.
So how many trees would you have?
So in general, our trees are small and planted close together, so about 1,000 trees to acre, so maybe 40,000 apple trees in total.
Okay. And how many varieties would you say across that?
I used to say about 50, but I actually have less now, because a good friend of mine from Dublin, David Llewellyn, had given me a sample of numerous trees to grow, and that orchard that those were in is now gone. So I have about 30, maybe it's just over 30 varieties at the moment, of which we sell about 15, and the others are ones which are just in trial, shall we say.
Right. So I think for most people listening, that's probably, the number of varieties is probably a bit of a shock, right? Because I think if you ask, average punter in the street, like, name a couple of apple varieties, they might be able to name 3, I'd say, like Pink Lady, Golden Delicious, you mentioned already, and maybe a few others. And that's the global picture. I know we've spoken about this before, is a real narrowing of what people are buying. Do you have a sense globally and in Ireland what kind of how concentrated is it?
Yeah, there are two forces, I suppose you might say, at play. Like, Ireland's most eaten apple nowadays is an apple called Gala, which there's one grower growing Galas in Ireland, but there's not many Galas grown in Ireland, so they're mostly imported from France and continental Europe, out of season, shall we say, which is next March, April, from Southern Hemisphere as well. Gala is one of the most grown apples in the world, but it suits a warmer climate than here.
Okay.
The biggest apple by value is Pink Lady, because they charge more for them. So even though there's less of them sold than Galas, they're the biggest one from a monetary perspective.
We don't grow that here?
We can't grow that here. No, the season isn't long enough or warm enough. Maybe we should say that was bred in Australia for a hot climate.
Okay.
People know those two, of course, because Gala is the one you get in all these fun size packs and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's not so much what people know, because they might know a few other apples like Braeburn, Fuji a few years ago or what have you, but it's more what they don't know. And what they don't know, of course, are Irish apples mostly. And that's because we've such a small proportion of the market. So we have, Irish apples supply about 5% of the total market in Ireland, and that then is split among a few different varieties. So you've got L-Stars and you've John O'Gould's, Red Prince, which is another type of John O'Gould, and so on. When you break them down, you've got maybe 1-2% of of those apples. So it's not surprising that people won't know what they are. When only 1 in 100 of the apples that they might see are will be one particular variety of Irish.
So 5% of the total consumption of apples in Ireland is Irish apples.
Correct. Yeah.
And like obviously the first thing people might think is, okay, so this is a seasonality issue, but we have apples, our own apples from when to when? July to November, something like that?
Yeah. Well, the ones that harvest in July wouldn't probably be suitable for sale through normal retail channels. They tend to be a bit soft and stuff like that. But certainly once you come into late August, there are apples which are entirely suitable for for sale through supermarkets and that kind of thing. And the later varieties, like the ones I mentioned that I'm picking in late October, November, those are apples that are were bred for storability, if you know what I mean. And you can put those into a cold store and you can take them out next April, May, even into June.
Wow.
And they'll still be pretty much like when they went in. So you've got easily 6-7 months of Irish apple supply if we had the production, but we don't have the production.
Okay, so it's even more than 6 months though, right? So you said late August, so say even September to what did you say, April?
April, that's 7 months
7 months, maybe 8 if you were lucky. So like 8/12 of a year we can potentially supply ourselves from. Why aren't we? That's the question.
And of course, I should mention the cooking apples as well go the full 12 months. Those are all Irish.
They'll store for the full 12
all Irish or British, if you know what I mean. But they could all be Irish.
Okay. I've sat in Borbia discussions and elsewhere, and we've been talking about this and apples as being, there's vegetables that we can't grow here, and there's vegetables that we can't compete, and so we import a lot of them. But apples is one where we could be, if not self-sufficient, we could certainly improve that by 5%. Like, why haven't we? What's the problem, do you think?
Yeah, I think, well, partly it was price, because I suppose you had an expectation that, among the people buying for supermarkets, that Irish apples ought to be cheaper than ones from abroad, because, there's no transport cost and stuff like that. But unfortunately, the cost of, as I mentioned earlier on, one of the advantages, of growing something like apples as opposed to veg is that, a person who's growing 3 times as much just has to have 3 times as much labor. But on the other hand, labor in a country like Ireland is substantially dearer than in many of the competing countries where apples would be coming from. So that means the cost of production is higher here as well. And apples have not been particularly profitable in other countries for the last decade or so either. And that's partly because of when the EU expanded, there was a lot of new apple production went into the eastern countries, into Poland and so on. Poland is Europe's biggest apple producer.
Wow.
Double what Italy is. And Italy used to be the EU's biggest producer, if you know what I mean. Just for example, and an awful lot of those Polish apples and so on used to go to Russia in the past. But once the first invasion of the Ukraine happened, apples were one of the things that they started sanctioning each other with.
Wow.
So no apples go from the EU. No apples from the EU go to Russia anymore.
Okay.
So that meant that the EU had this big lot of apples, that should have been going somewhere else, all coming into Western Europe and lowering the general price, if you know what I mean.
And are they new types of varieties, or are they?
Generally, in Poland they grow things like John O'Golds and some of the ones that would be familiar here. We don't get those apples don't come here. It's just that they come a little bit west, and they push the price down, and the ones from somewhere else then come here. You know what I mean? So it's just a general displacement. We wouldn't see many Polish apples in the shops here.
Yeah. And of course, it's not a quick turnaround to ramp up your apple production as a nation.
To ramp down either, you know what I mean? Let's say a Polish producer has, planted an orchard and is 5 years old, and, the plan was to have it for 20 years. It's a very big decision to pull that out after 8 or 9 years when you're probably still in debt. You know what I mean? So there's that problem as well. So it's, as you say, it's very hard to get into. Now, here in Ireland, there has been a lot of positivity in the last probably 5 years or so, thanks to Borbia and thanks to Teagasc, both of whom have been putting, and the Department of Agriculture, to be fair, and they've all been kind of buying into this revitalization plan for the apple industry. It's not a quick thing, but Teagasc, for the first time ever, have an experimental horticulture apple orchard, I should say, in Oak Park in Carlow. They hired a really really capable scientist to run that, and he has other people working with him as well. We have done a lot of research and are continuing to do research, to try and flesh out which of the varieties that they're trying out there in Carlow are going to have market acceptability and so on. And we're also looking at varieties which will have more disease resistance and that kind of thing, because of course everyone wants to use less chemicals, and it'll probably be regulated anyway that we'll be using less chemicals and that kind of thing. All of that is very positive. The attitude of the buyers has changed a lot as well, because they see that, just for example, this year, Poland's crop is down about 70% due to very bad spring. So you just can't. About 70% down, yeah.
That's like carnage for
it.
A
Is
lot of
carnage
growers,
for
right?
them, absolutely, yeah. It's just a weather lottery these days. So it's them this year, it could be you next year or somebody else next year. Who knows?
So we might come back to the climate change sort of issues, because that's definitely something I want to get your views on. Grab yourself a mouthful of coffee in the meantime. What I just wanted to follow up on there, like you said earlier on, that you're taking some trees out and planting some trees. If I was a brand new, starting from scratch, how long before I have product to sell? Certainly.
That's such a hard one. I would never be in a hurry to recommend anyone to go into apple growing until they know quite a bit about apple growing, if you know what I mean, because mistakes are expensive. Yeah, and you mightn't survive beyond your third or fourth one. And that's
how do you learn if you're not?
Well, I would be suggesting that anyone who wants to grow apples, I mentioned David Llewellyn earlier on, and David came from a background that was not horticultural, if you know what I mean. He first of all did a horticultural college, then he went to UCD and did a degree. Then he spent a few years in Germany on apple farms, learning how to grow apples and stuff like that. And 10 years later, he felt he was ready.
Yeah, you'd be a doctor quicker.
Yeah, you would, yeah. Absolutely. But you don't have to go to those kind of lengths. You can hire in expertise, to assist you in that. You really do need to be serious about it if you're going to be a commercial grower,
What's your sense of, say, in the last 5 years, or maybe in the next 2 to 3, like, are there new entrants coming in? Are you seeing sort of acres being put down?
There's a couple of new orchards in the country now. There was one planted in Wexford, I think it's about 40 or 50 acres, and they're harvesting apples, as in, this year's probably their first proper harvest.
Right.
There was another one put in near Slane, which is bigger than that, I think 80 or 90 acres.
Wow.
Now that was from a family that are involved in apples, although I don't think they used to grow much in Northern Ireland. I think they were mostly, buying and selling apples, but they know apples, shall we say. There are a few going in that is increasing production, but that part of it wasn't part of the redevelopment plan, shall we say. The redevelopment plan is more so about seeing what the market can support, and then, I'm sure the Department of Agriculture will be offering grants for planting and stuff like that. But they will probably have criteria set as to, what kind of land you should be growing it on, or, various things, which makes sense if they're going to be part funding it. You know what I mean? You don't want to be putting it up on the hill of Connemara.
It's a bit of an exploration phase still.
Yes.
Would that be at a national level?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's promising,
but it's getting close to the point. It's getting close to the point, maybe another 2 years, 3 years, where I think at that point you either have to pull the trigger or just say, okay, we're not going to. We're just going to forget about it. Yeah.
From a consumer perspective, obviously, I'm assuming your advice would be seek out an Irish apple, and particularly like Patrick, our producer, was saying, and a very wise man I always listen to. This is the time of the year when you get to experience again what an apple should taste like. I think like there is that moment when you eat an Irish apple and you go, oh my God, like this is totally different to anything you taste for the rest of the year. Yeah, like we have to vote with our wallets, don't we? And buy them, maybe store them as well. If you
it's difficult to, if you can find them. You see, if you go into the shop and you got a big wall of apples, and typically in the shop there's several boxes, or maybe even 10 or 20 boxes of different apples. You know what I mean? And probably just one of those is going to be Irish. Yeah, and the flag is probably hanging somewhere in general around the apple area, and a lot of people just the number of people who said to me, I bought Granny Smith's, they're obviously Irish, aren't they? Because it just sounds like Granny Smith is an Irish person, you know what I mean? Like it's
is there any advice you can give people to know? Is there particular varieties we should be seeking out?
Well, if they're Irish, they will say Irish on the pack, but you need to look at the origin, that little print that says origin, wherever it is, so it'll be France or Ireland or occasionally or wherever, you know what I mean, New Zealand generally. That's the place to look, is just on the origin thing. It's tricky, you know, when you're in a rush and you're, you know, then you've got the kids that only eat this type anyway, you know, the kind of thing as well. So,
yeah. So you need to be discerning, I suppose, is the advice to consumers. And I always think, on top of the look, the variety, the flavour, you might have a packaging consideration if you're trying to reduce your packaging.
Absolutely, there's all those factors. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
A quick one. Now, I know you get asked on almost every podcast these days to hit that follow or subscribe button, but they never really tell you why that's important. Simply put, if you hit the follow button, it helps us to grow the show, get more great guests, and to reach more people just like you. So it's a small gesture from you that means a huge amount to us. Thanks. Now back to the episode.
And I suppose the thing for retailers is they should be supporting more Irish growers when they can and so on, but that's a whole other ball of wax, as they say. Con, one of the things that jumps out as something that's a bit different about your story is that you've obviously got the farm shop on the farm. Anyone that's ever been there will know it's a fantastic place to go into. You've obviously kind of made a decision to kind of upsell the product, in the sense that you're selling juices and you're finding ways to sort of build margin into the product and so on. But then also there's the agritourism side of it. It's a place where people can go and stay. And I was just talking to one of the lads downstairs, said that they've camped there a couple of times and stuff. So it's a fantastic place to be as well. Was that sort of needs must and just trying to make it all work, or was there an intentionality behind it?
Well, the farm shop was definitely needs must, because when my parents started growing, let's say, the vegetables and the fruit in the first years, what they discovered was that, you know, there wasn't really a ready market for those things. At that time, a lot of people still grew apples in their farms and, you know, that kind of thing.
Especially country people,
yeah,
I guess,
absolutely,
where you were based.
Where we were, exactly. You know, and people didn't move around like they do nowadays. You know what I mean? Like, you know, not everyone had a car or whatever. They found that, you know, bringing apples into Care or Clonmel or whatever, that they wouldn't sell, you know, even a modicum of what they were growing. So they tried to figure out other ways, and, you know, they noticed other farmers might put up a sign, "Hay for sale," or something like that. So they were just very fortunate, in as much as the farm that they had bought was on the main Limerick Waterford Road. It could have been 2 miles inland, shall we say, and a sign would have been no good to them because nobody would have ever passed. Yeah. But they just happened to have this road frontage. Yeah, absolutely. And it meant that when they stuck up a sign, the people started calling, and it took a long time, but it took off eventually. So that was needs must, and that's how they ended up planting, as I mentioned, the second orchard in 1982, 14 years after the first one.
Wow.
And then it kind of began to take off, you know what I mean? So, you know, customer numbers increased, and I suppose the other things changed at that time as well. You know, people stopped, you know, a lot of, you know, the home farms would have taken out orchards and all that kind of thing. So there was a lot of changing dynamics at that point.
And what about the juicing and productizing, I suppose, the apples then?
Yeah, so the juicing, I started that in 1995. So if it wasn't the hottest summer on record, it was probably one of the hottest summers on record. At that time, it was the hottest summer on record in Ireland. We had a huge crop of apples as a consequence, because apples do like it a little bit warmer than what our typical summer is.
Right.
You know, I didn't want to sell all these apples into Bulmers and, you know, just let them make cider out of them because they were too nice. There was another farmer in Cappoquin, David Keane. Himself and his wife were making apple juice, and I asked them, could they make some for me? And I sent them down a few bins of apples, and they made 1,600 bottles, and I thought that would do me for the year, and it was gone in like a month or a month and a half or something like that. And it was immediately obvious that there was appetite for this product, that nobody, well, Keens were making it in Cappoquin, but nobody else in the country was making it. Back then, there wasn't a lot of money floating around, but I went to Leader, and they agreed to, you know, to fund me building a little juice room or whatever on the farm, which we did. And in 1996, we started making it ourselves. So it was
fantastic. The benefit of that, beyond it's a fantastic product, is it's a storage thing as well, effectively, because it's pasteurized. The shelf life, I guess, is, I don't know how long
the official shelf life is a year from manufacture.
Yeah.
So it helps us keep them, but it also means that we can use any apples that are too big, too small, funny shape, you know, all that kind of thing. So, you know, cosmetically inferior, but still perfect.
Yeah. Brilliant. Like, so you mentioned Bulmers there. What's the sort of, from a total output perspective, obviously you've got the farm shop. Are you selling into retail at all?
Yes, we are, because we have, I suppose, it depends on the year a little bit, but probably about a third of our production is excess to what we need for either our own juice or our own farm shop.
Yeah.
So we do sell that. Dunn Stores are taking an apple called Red Prince, and they have that in their Simply Better line.
Okay. What's the experience been like for you for working with retailers?
Well, I found Dunn Stores to be very helpful, very agreeable.
Okay.
I couldn't say a bad word.
All right.
I was very happy.
It's unusual for a food producer to be. No, it's great. That's great to hear, because I suppose the common experience, I think, for a lot of food producers is not that. So that is good. And that, I think, suggests, you know, an openness to working with a good Irish product and a consumer demand for that, right?
Yeah. And to be fair, in general, and I can't speak for everyone, but I think apple growers probably get a slightly, you know, there is a lot of demand. Consumers is one of the main things that people expect to see Irish, even though they might mistakenly think something is Irish that isn't, if you know what I mean. They do know that apples grow here, and
there's still not a lot obvious.
And they do get asked a lot. The retailers do get asked a lot for Irish apples.
Yeah.
So it probably puts a little bit more pressure on them to have them as well. So it means that we have a little bit more maybe bargaining power than we might even realise.
Are you still into Bulmers as well? Or into cider?
No, we stopped going into Bulmers a few years ago now, partly just because, you know, the price wouldn't be huge. But also they're not really looking for as many apples as they used to. They have a lot of tanks and that they're, you know, with cider in them that sees them several years ahead, if you know what I mean. But at the moment they're just taking what's there, but they're not out actively looking for more.
Okay. You alluded to plums. I know you have cherries, because the last time I met you on the farm, I think it was cherry season, so we were sampling some of them. They were gorgeous. You're growing them in tunnels, I think.
Cherries, in Ireland, this is really your only choice is to grow them under protection, partly because of the birds, partly because of rain, you know, so we were growing those in tunnels,
And so anything else? Oh, strawberries as well, right?
Strawberries and raspberries, yeah. So the strawberries are growing both outdoors and indoors, you know, depending on when we're picking them and that kind of thing. And the raspberries are all indoors now, actually. We used to grow them all outside, but there was a new pest arrived in Ireland, I suppose, biosecurity not being what it used to be, you know, with all the fruit being moved all around the world very quickly. So, you know, if you buy raspberries or strawberries or blueberries or something like that, you'll often see they're coming from Peru or you know, California or Florida or whatever, you know,
so we brought in
out
this
of season. So
what was the disease? It's a pest, was it?
Yeah, a little pest. It's a fruit fly called spotted winged Drosophila. It's a difficult one because it's one of the few fruit flies that can lay its eggs into unripe fruit. Normally the fruit have to be ripe or overripe for the fruit fly to attack them. And it kind of, once it got out of a punnet somewhere, it got into our hedges and moved around Ireland, into blackberries and so on like that. And it doesn't die in the wintertime because our winter isn't cold enough. And there aren't any natural predators for it because the predator wasn't imported with the pest.
Isn't that amazing?
So, you know, they're screening predators. There are predators where this originally comes from. There are predators that manage it, but they don't want to bring those into Europe until they're sure that predator won't in turn, you know, affect
to have a knock-on effect.
So that might be another 10 years.
What does it do to the raspberries?
It lays its eggs into unripe raspberries, and you will have little maggots on the raspberry then at harvest time or whatever. So
So
that means we brought them inside so that we can keep the pest outside, keep the fruit inside.
Okay. Yeah. And raspberries undercover, like I'm guessing water needs are kind of a big thing there.
Yeah, right? Anything is growing undercover, it needs watering as often as it needs it. Let's say we have raspberries undercover which are growing in soil. You know, and watering once a day is fine with those because, of course, the soil holds lots of water and so on. But if you're growing them in a pot, which we also do, you know, watering 3 times a day or whatever would be. So that's just a watering system that cuts in for 5 minutes 3 times a day or whatever. But at that point, you would need automated watering. You couldn't be going around doing that.
Like, obviously, you said yourself, like an awful lot of manual work with apples, like the pruning, the things that can't be automated. So I'm assuming, like, seasonally you must be employing quite a few people.
Yeah, we have about 20 staff all year round.
Wow.
And we would top up with probably an extra 5 or 6 during harvest, and our 2 harvests are in the summertime with the strawberries and that kind of thing.
It's not very seasonal then, the labour, like it's pretty
no,
consistent.
it's not because the guys who are doing the pruning at this time of year, of course, they're
the
picking.
harvesting.
Exactly. We would take on a few kind of students, just locals, during the summertime for the strawberry harvest and that kind of thing, and then they're all gone back to college typically. You know what I mean? So then you're organised to have some people available for the apple harvest, and they would typically be people who usually, one of the guys working for us, I've got a few people from Poland, Czech Republic, places like that working for me, and they'll know somebody who's looking to come and do some work for. Exactly.
Brilliant. So that's a pretty significant employer as well then. Con, there's 2 things I want to talk about before we finish. Like, I'm really conscious I could literally talk all morning to you, but we mightn't have anyone listening to us by the end of it, so we won't do that. I want to get to the climate change impacts on your work as well, but then to also talk about sort of the organic side of things with apples and pesticide use, because I guess apples have a reputation obviously as being like super healthy, and they are. But like, I suppose chemical usage in apple production can be significant as well. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose
that?
Our climate is good for growing apple trees and trees in general, obviously. But of course, the varieties that we have tend to be susceptible to fungus diseases, and the main fungus disease that causes trouble is a thing called apple scab or black spot. Now, if you're growing an apple tree in your garden and you just have one apple tree in your garden, it's unlikely that that disease will ever cause a massive problem. You'll get spotting on your apples and you might lose some leaves or whatever. But if you have 10,000 trees of the same variety going together and you get a spot on the first one, it'll spread, and next thing you have almost a non-harvest or whatever. So that basically means that apple growers are spraying, especially in the early part of the year when you've got these small tender leaves on the trees and small fruit, which are very susceptible to this disease. So typically you're spraying in sometime in March, in April and in May, and if you get out of the end of May or early June and you're clean, you can pretty much stop at that point. And how often you spray will be, we have these weather stations around the country, and that data is sent off and analysed, and they model what's happening in the orchard and so on. So you get advice from the modelling people as to whether you need to do an intervention or not. I suppose you asked about organics as well. Like, organic apple growers will also spray if they want to keep black spot or apple scab off their trees, but they're limited to only spraying what's permitted organically, if you know what I mean.
Right.
Or they can accept that they're going to get a lot of damage, but mostly the likes of High Bank Orchard or whatever, they use their apples only in processing, so they don't try to sell them as fresh apples.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And they don't spray at all, which works as well.
So that'll be going into a juice.
As you said
earlier on,
all sorts
matter
of interesting things.
Because
Because they end up distilling it into brandy and everything, so they make all sorts.
Do you have any organic production on the farm?
For example, with the plums, we don't have to spray fungicide, but we still actually spray a herbicide under the trees once a year to manage the weeds or whatever, because we're not organic anyway. But it wouldn't be a hard thing, let's say, to convert the plums to organic. Do you know what I mean? I won't say it's not a priority for me, but what's a priority for me is actually to try and optimize the system I have to minimize the amount of spraying and stuff that we're doing, rather than going by a rule book, which isn't necessarily always the best idea either.
I understand.
Yeah.
And presumably, like, it wouldn't be viable to have like 5% of your apples organic, because you run the risk of bringing diseases in.
If I was going to have an organic orchard, I would, almost like you're implying there, I would go and buy a field a few miles away and start fresh with varieties that are more resistant to disease. And we have some varieties that are disease resistant on the farm, but there's still too many that are susceptible as well. So you'd be starting with a totally new system. You'd be putting in rootstocks that are that have tolerance for woolly aphid, for example, or resistance to woolly aphid. You'd be designing it from the ground up rather than with what we have now, shall we say. But if you were to design it from the ground up, you could probably quite an interesting go at growing apples organically in Ireland. But it would be, you wouldn't be starting from where I am.
I understand. It's like a tanker. It's not easy to turn it around. I suppose that probably does bring us towards a related discussion, which is the climate change and the impact that that's having. You called it a kind of bit of a weather lottery earlier on, which was an interesting way to describe it. Last 10 years, is it just the unpredictability of it? But then there's things that can happen that can wipe out an apple crop, right?
Yeah. I mean, the really obvious thing that's been progressive and consistent over the last 40 years is that the springs are getting a little bit earlier every year,
right,
on average. So much so that we're almost, I would say, 3 weeks earlier than when my father was, farming. That's a lot. That's 3 weeks of vegetation appearing earlier on the trees. Often it was...
That's a good thing, though, is it?
Well, not really, because once the leaves appear, at a certain point after that, the flowers will appear. And once the flowers appear, you're at risk of night frost. Yeah. So if frost comes while there's flowers, anything below maybe -1 or whatever will kill the flowers. And that means that those flowers can't give you apples.
Fruit, right.
So if you've got an extra 3 weeks of, a frost risk, you're increasing your likelihood of being hit with a frost. Yeah. Now, the frosts are also, probably becoming less common.
Less severe.
But having said that, they can still come at any time up to probably the first week in May or thereabouts. And at that point, then the days are getting long enough that the frost just won't come at night.
I saw these extraordinary images on social media, I guess, in the vineyards in France and them putting like kind of heat underneath the vines and stuff with those late frosts coming in. So that's the same issue there, I guess.
The same issue, although we don't, grapes being a higher value crop, they can afford to, burn materials in the vineyard to protect the crop. It's not something that's done in apples.
Is there anything you can do?
Well, there are a couple of growers who have these wind machines, and what they do is, because hot air rises, so if you get a radiation frost, as in, a frost when there's a still night, you have an area of air usually up like 20 meters in the air that's a bit warmer than the air at ground level. It's like a wind turbine except the other way around, and it pulls the air back down, mixes it with the cold air, and that'll give you a rise of maybe 2 degrees Celsius, which can save you. I never invested in a wind machine, but I've been looking, not with huge interest, but I've been wondering whether a few drones, as in mid-sized drones, and not the little small ones, but a few drones in the right place hovering around might do the same job. I'd be interested to see if anyone has any ideas on that. Because that'd be something that you might be able to borrow or rent or what have you. Other than that, you can also spray water on the plants, and that helps them, because the water freezes, but it doesn't go below zero as long as you keep on spraying water on it. That would be done a lot in the Netherlands and places like that, where of course they've an inexhaustible supply of water in the canals and so on. We haven't ever tried it here.
That's counterintuitive, isn't it? Like putting water onto it to prevent damage from frost.
So you end up with this tree which is covered in ice, with just a little layer of water on the outside of the ice. The temperature of that ice doesn't go below zero, the way it works. And it definitely works, but you need a lot of water, and you also need a free draining soil, because when all that thaws again, you'll end up with a flood. Yeah.
And when's the last time that you had a massive frost impact on the crop?
So it was 3 seasons ago, so we lost about half a crop, which was as bad as what we ever lost.
That is potentially a business killer.
If we didn't have all our other strawberries and other crops that year, if it was just apples, it would have been
serious
disastrous.
And you pointed to like the situation in Poland. Was that this year?
That was this year.
70%.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, so so those late frosts, early springs and late frost is the combination of the two, I guess, that work hand in hand.
The other thing we're seeing a bit more of is summer hail, which wasn't a very common thing. When we got hail in Ireland, it tended to be in the winter time. But you put more energy into the clouds, into the heat up the atmosphere, and you will get more summer hail. Summer hail would not have been uncommon, let's say, in the Netherlands, even, when my parents were there. But they were always amazed at how it never really, you would get these tiny little localized hail showers, but not like a hailstorm.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing hailstorms, and I've seen...
And that's the time of the year when you've got
you have
flowers.
You would have fruit on the trees probably
so
if
it's
it's
beyond
summertime.
flowers.
The hailstones will impact on the fruit and cause a little bruise, or if it's severe enough, even a hole in puncture the skin. And then obviously those apples are, if they're punctured, they'll probably rot before you ever get to pick them. If they're just bruised, you know, you'll just have to use them for processing or whatever.
We were talking on the way in this morning, a beautiful frosty morning here, proper winter weather, and you were saying this is good for the apple. Why is it good?
Well, apple trees, you know, they evolved, I suppose, you know, in places climatically like here. In other words, with, you know, long winters and, you know, temperatures that are around zero for quite a while. And in the autumn time, the leaves of the trees produce a chemical that tells the tree to go dormant, but also keeps them dormant, so they won't wake up with the first bit of sunshine on 1st of January if you get a nice week. Yeah. They still won't start growing, and that's because they have this signal built into them to tell them not to go. Wow. And that breaks down, you know, in temperatures between 0 and 5-6 degrees. So if you get that winter temperature, it's slowly but surely, you know, breaking down this molecule that's in the buds of the trees that will eventually allow the trees to grow when that's absent in next March or whatever.
So these milder winters can disrupt that, I guess, right?
Exactly. If it's too mild, you won't get that breaking down, and then the trees are unsure whether to grow or whatever when the time comes. Yeah.
I was going to say it's the all-round unpredictability, but we might be settling into a pattern that you can adapt to, I guess. Can you?
I don't detect a pattern yet, unfortunately.
Right.
I wish I did. Anything that you can predict, you can prepare for. So let's say this new orchard that I mentioned that we're putting in will have hail protection, which is the first time we're ever putting in hail protection on our farm.
From that point of view,
so it's netting.
Netting?
It's like netting, it's netting. And of course, you know, there is that bit of you know, you don't want to be putting up plastic in your orchard, and it is obviously, you know, plastic that's used for that. But you know, those are the choices that you're being forced into, really, by the circumstances.
An extra expense as well, I guess.
Expense as well.
Yeah. Okay, so Con, I want to finish with two slightly practical questions, I guess. My first one is like, for people that want to put like an apple tree in their garden, even if it's a small garden, I always think it's an amazing thing for people to do, to even if you don't manage to grow a whole lot. I think it's just a brilliant thing to be able to harvest some of your own apples. So that's the first question, maybe some tips on that. And then secondly, maybe asking you to pick a favourite child, but what's your favourite variety of apples? Maybe start with some tips for the home grower.
So
it's a good time of the year to start thinking about it.
First of all, it's a good time of year to think about it. It's a good time of year to plant a tree. I suppose the first step is make sure that you pick one on a rootstock.
Just explain what a rootstock is.
The rootstock is the root of the tree, shall we say. And, you know, commercially, apple growers grow trees these days on a rootstock called M9, and that'll give you a tree which will probably grow to about 8 feet tall at max. So that would suit a small to medium garden. If you have a really small space, you can get something on an M27 rootstock, which would probably only go to 5 or 6 feet tall.
Okay.
If you got a bigger space, you can grow onto an M26 or some other larger rootstock. It's almost more important to check the rootstock, because if your tree is eventually going to outgrow the room that you have for it, you're going to be trying to prune it to keep it in space. And if you keep on pruning, it's going to keep on coming back at you with more shoots, and then it won't give you fruit because it doesn't like being pruned too much. It's really important to get that right first. Get your rootstock right first.
Like, for people that maybe don't sort of know this world very well, so the rootstock is basically like your foundation. It'll determine how big the tree gets, and onto that rootstock
will
put a variety on.
Exactly.
So it's like your sort of building block, effectively.
Yeah, exactly. So they can,
and I guess your garden centre will be able to advise.
Yeah, it will usually say on the label which rootstock it is, but people probably just don't know what they're looking at.
Ask the question of a good garden centre. They'll help you with that. Yeah. And then varieties,
try and get something that is, now this isn't as easy as it sounds, that is more disease tolerant, because we have, you know, more than one disease. There's powdery mildew, and there's apple scab, and there's canker. So for example, there's an apple called Discovery, which is great on mildew and on apple scab, but you'll never see them on it, but it gets canker, and if that can kill the tree. If you get past the first few years, the canker isn't a problem anymore, so it's a matter of a bit of luck. I would recommend a Discovery tree, and hopefully you'll get past. I also recommend an apple called Katie, which is not the nicest tasting apple, but it is very reliable in gardens. It doesn't get canker scab or mildew. So from that point of view, it's great. And then there are other disease-resistant varieties that are coming, but they're not widely available yet, so that's a little bit harder. But I would steer well clear of the likes of Cox's Orange Pippin or Elster or John O'Gould's, because they are disease magnets.
Right, okay. I was going to ask about John O'Gould, because that is a beautiful... And the Discovery one, would that be the best taste apple of the ones you mentioned?
Yeah.
Because I agree with you about Katie. It's a brilliant early apple and very reliable, but not brilliant flavour.
Not great flavour. There's one called Red Windsor, which is fairly disease tolerant as well, and I have seen it round in garden centres and that kind of thing. So if you could get your hands on that, and that's later than the Discovery.
Okay. That brings us then to, I suppose, your favourite variety, if you were to pick one.
Well, you really did say it there, because it is like having a favourite child. Like, I love Discovery, you know, when they come first thing in the season, but then something else comes and you're there for that.
But I guess that's the point, right? It's the mix is what's important here. And as consumers in all sorts of areas of fruit and veg, we've got so little choice now because of the way the food system has gone. So, like, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Like, we've got hundreds of Irish apple varieties that we're just not getting access to, I guess. And so, like, they all have their own benefits, different times of the year, different flavours, different texture, exactly. That's
and I think
the joy of it.
You know, if you eat the same apple every day, great, but I think it's more interesting to eat a few different types.
Absolutely. And so say all of us. I think that's a brilliant way for us to finish. Con, we have a closing tradition on this podcast that we ask people, why does food matter to Contrast?
Oh gosh, that's you better not be expecting a short answer, because like
minimum 25 minutes.
The obvious thing, you know, is nourishment. You know, we all need food for nourishment and so on, which is ultimately, I suppose, how we started farming in the first place. And farming, I suppose, in general, of course, you know, if you go back far enough, everyone farmed, and now very few people farm, and it's getting like that. But of course, all that, you know, agricultural productivity is what's created the space for us all to do all these other things, you know, that everything from, you know, healthcare to going on holidays to you name it, everything that, you know, if we were all still stuck in the field, we wouldn't be doing much of that. So I just love the whole food production, you know, thing from that point of view. It is absolutely amazing that, you know, nowadays on average we spend probably 6 or 7% of our income on food, whereas even in my parents' time that was 30%. You know what I mean? It's such a change, and it underpins so much of society, and people don't think about it really, but it actually does. What else? Just, you know, enjoying food with people. What a great way to to spend time. Absolutely. You know, from that point of view as well. I don't want to be, you know, bringing up something depressing, I suppose, in a sense, but if we run into trouble with food production, and we might, you know, with climate changing so rapidly, you know, all that social cohesion that comes from not having people starving, you know, literally, you know, because hungry people won't be happy people.
Like, it's extraordinary how, as you say, like 6% of our income on food, like how little we really appreciate how tenuous the whole thing is. Like, and I think these conversations, talking to all the food producers we've spoken to in the last year, it is extraordinary how tenuous it is. Like, it really is so finely balanced, and something like climate change can come along and knock it out of whack very easily.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the case.
Con, thanks a million. Listen, I just want to say to people, if you're on that road from, I went to university in UL, so I was up and down that road the whole time, and have swung into the apple farm. It's a brilliant place to visit. Like, really check it out. And actually, what I've done a couple of times is bought a box of apples off you and stored them at home in a, you know, in newspaper or whatever. So that's something people should consider as well. To lay down a nice apple crop for the winter is a very pleasing thing as well. And thank you for all your work and for coming along. Really appreciate it. And it's been great to have a chat with you.
I really enjoy that. And your coffee. Thank you very much.
As always, I want to say that we could not do Food Matters without our amazing team. Our producer and editor is Patrick Haughey. Pre-production, guest research and booking by Caroline Hennessy. Marketing, PR and social is done by the amazing GIY marketing team of Jen Langan, Catherine Keary and Susanna Phillip. Finally, thanks to each and every one of you for listening. Do please get in touch with us if you've got any feedback. We absolutely love hearing from you. And we're looking forward to your company on the next episode of Food Matters.